Our text for today is taken from the book of Esther, chapter 9, beginning with verse 1. Reading from the New Living Translation of the Scriptures, the word of the Lord is as follows. So on March 7th, the two decrees of the king were put into effect. On that day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but quite the opposite happened. It was the Jews who overpowered their enemies. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the king's provinces to attack anyone who tried to harm them. But no one could make a stand against them, for everyone was afraid of them. And all the nobles of the princes, the highest officers, the governors, and the royal officials helped the Jews for fear of Mordecai. For Mordecai had been promoted in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces as he became more and more powerful. So the Jews went ahead on the appointed day and struck down their enemies with the sword. They killed and annihilated their enemies and did as they pleased with those who hated them. In the fortress of Susa itself, the Jews killed 500 men. They also killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, Bezatha, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not take any plunder. That very day, when the king was informed of the number of people killed in the fortress of Susa, he called for Queen Esther. He said, "The Jews have killed 500 men in the fortress of Susa alone, as well as Haman's 10 sons. They have done that there. What has happened in the rest of the provinces? But now, what more do you want? It will be granted to you. Tell me, and I will do it." Esther responded, "If it please the king, give the Jews in Susa permission to do again tomorrow as they have done today, and that the bodies of Haman's 10 sons be impaled on a pole." So the king agreed, and the decree was announced in Susa. And they impaled the bodies of Haman's 10 sons. Then the Jews at Susa gathered together on March 8th and killed 300 more men. Again, they took no plunder. Meanwhile, the other Jews throughout the king's provinces had gathered together to defend themselves. They gained relief from all their enemies, killing 75,000 of those who hated them. But they did not take any plunder. This was done throughout the provinces on March 7th. And on March 8th, they rested, celebrating their victory with a day of feasting and gladness. The Jews at Susa killed their enemies on March 7th and again on March 8th, then on March 9th, making that their day of feasting and gladness. So to this day, rural Jews living in remote villages celebrate an annual festival and holiday on the appointed day in late winter, when they rejoice and send gifts of food to each other. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to the Jews near and far throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes, calling on them to celebrate an annual festival on these 2 days. He told them to celebrate these days with feasting and gladness, and by giving gifts of food to each other and presents to the poor. This would commemorate a time when the Jews gained relief from their enemies, when their sorrow was turned into gladness, and their mourning into joy. So the Jews accepted Mordecai's proposal and adopted this annual custom. Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted to crush and destroy them on the date determined by casting lots. The lots were called Purim. But when Esther came before the king, he issued a decree causing Haman's evil plot to backfire, and Haman and his sons were impaled on a sharpened pole. That is why this celebration is called Purim, because it is the ancient word for casting lots. So because of Mordecai's letter and because of what they had experienced, the Jews throughout the realm agreed to inaugurate this tradition and to pass it on to their descendants and to all who became Jews. They declared they would never fail to celebrate these 2 prescribed days at the appointed time each year. These days would be remembered and kept from generation to generation and celebrated by every family throughout the provinces and cities of the empire. This festival of Purim would never cease to be celebrated among the Jews, nor would the memory of what happened ever die out among their descendants. Thus far, the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. They declared they would never fail to celebrate these 2 prescribed days at the appointed time each year. These days would be remembered and kept from generation to generation and celebrated by every family throughout the provinces and cities of the empire. This festival of Purim would never cease to be celebrated among the Jews, nor would the memory of what happened ever die out among their descendants. This is part 2 of A Time to Remember. On last Sunday, in commemoration of Juneteenth, we observed that there are certain works of God, certain moves of God that should never be forgotten. Their impact, their import, their substance, their sweep, and their sway are of such significance that they must be rehearsed. They must be retold. They must be remembered, made a member again, from generation to generation. God, being a God of memory, calls his people to points and places of remembrance. We are a people called to remember, to make present again, to celebrate. On last Sunday, we dealt with the feast day or the festival of Passover and unleavened bread. The text provides us, this text now provides us with another festival. And it gives us the backstory whereby God's people are called to remembrance by a festival called Purim. It is located within the story of Esther, the queen of Persia. Her ascendancy to the throne is rather extraordinary because Esther's family was among those Jews taken into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And they remained in the region when the Persians took over the area. She is among the generation of Jews not born in Israel, but born in exile. She is a native diasporan Jew, born and raised in a foreign land, grows up in Persia. And at the time that this story begins, Esther's only remaining family was an older cousin named Mordecai, who adopted and raised her as his own daughter. The book opens with the account of a dysfunctional relationship between Xerxes, king of Persia, and his wife, the queen named Vashti. It is such a dysfunctional relationship that it results in the banishment of Vashti from the palace and creates a vacancy on the throne. A search begins for a young virgin woman who could become the next queen of Persia. Esther was among the young women brought into the king's harem for consideration. At the advice of Mordecai, Esther kept her Jewish identity and background a secret. She gains favor in the eyes of Haggai, the overseer of the king's harem, who provided her with beauty treatments, tutored her in the protocol of the court, assigned maids from the king's palace to her, and then moved her into the best place in the harem. When the time came for her to be presented before the king, the word says that the king was so taken by her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her to be queen instead of Vashti. Running concurrently with this, Xerxes, king of Persia, elevated a man by the name of Haman above all of the Persian princes. All of the servants of the king, with the exception of Mordecai, paid homage to Haman. And Haman took offense at Mordecai's failure to bow to him. Therefore, rather than kill Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all of Mordecai's people. Consequently, shortly after Xerxes has coronated Esther as queen, Haman set an evil plot to kill all of the Jews that lived in Persia. He informs Xerxes that the Jews weren't keeping his laws and were a threat to the advancement of the kingdom. Therefore, the king should issue a decree that they be destroyed and pay those who would kill them. Xerxes agreed and had the decree written. The time for the execution was to be the 13th day of the 12th month. And all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, were to be killed. As Mordecai learned of the edict, he was understandably devastated. And when Esther became aware of Mordecai's distress, she sent a messenger to find out the reason. Mordecai informed the messenger of the plot to destroy the people, sent him back with the text of the edict, and urged Esther to go before the king to seek mercy on behalf of her people. Esther responded by saying it would be out of order for her to do so because the king had not called for her to appear before him for some time. It is then that Mordecai uttered these well-remembered words. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. I know that there have been moments where you have heard those words, for such a time as this. Well, this is where that is found. Mordecai sort of checks Esther to cause her to realize you are not where you are just for you to be there. No, you are where you are for such a time as this. Don't think that it's an accident that I had you keep your Jewish identity on the QT, because God knew that there would be a time when it would be right for you to reveal who you are for such a time as this. Now awakened to a sense of assigned destiny, after a time of fasting, Esther approached Xerxes and initiated a plan. The plan was to expose Haman and to protect her people. Chapters 7 and 8 give us Esther's executing her plan to expose Haman and to protect her people, and it resulted in Haman's execution, a reversal of Haman's orders, and Mordecai's elevation. This now brings us to chapter 9 and the institution of the festival of Purim as a time of remembrance from generation to generation. Now, while it is the case that we do not observe the festival of Purim, what Purim lifts up in remembrance is worthy of our attention and our celebration. Verses 20 through 26 read this way. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to the Jews near and far throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes, calling on them to celebrate an annual festival on these 2 days. He told them to celebrate these days with feasting and gladness by giving gifts of food to each other and presents to the poor. This would commemorate a time when the Jews gained relief from their enemies, when their sorrow was turned into gladness and their mourning into joy. So the Jews accepted Mordecai's proposal and adopted this annual custom. Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted to crush and destroy them on the date determined by casting lots. The lots were called Purim. But when Esther came before the king, he issued a decree causing Haman's evil plot to backfire, and Haman and his sons were impaled on a sharpened pole. That is why this celebration is called Purim, because it is the ancient word for casting lots. So because of Mordecai's letter, because of what they had experienced, the Jews throughout the realm agreed to inaugurate this tradition, to pass it on to their descendants and to all who became Jews. They declared they would never fail to celebrate these two prescribed days at the appointed time each year. These days would be remembered and kept from generation to generation and celebrated by every family throughout the provinces and cities of the empire. There are several things that are worth remembering that I just want to lift up for us today. And the first thing worth remembering is this. Remember the time when God frustrated the plans that the enemy made against you. Remember the time when God frustrated the plans that the enemy made against you. The 2 days that are set aside for celebration. And what intrigues me about this is when they celebrate. Celebration kicks off on the day that Haman picked to be the day of their destruction. The day that Haman picked to be the day of their downfall is the day that they pick to be the day of their celebration. So on March 7th, the two decrees of the king were put into effect. On that day, the enemies had hoped to destroy them, but quite the opposite happened. March 7th was the day set for their destruction. It was the day that Haman hoped to be rid of them. It was a time imagined for them to be done. And on the day that they should have been dead, the opposite happened. On the day that they should have been out of it, the opposite happened. On the day that they should have been done for, the opposite occurred. The very fact that they were alive to pick March 7th as being the beginning of the celebration was enough for them to shout off. The hopes of the enemy were not fulfilled. The plans of the adversary did not occur. My brothers and sisters, the March 7ths of life are worth remembering. March 7th is symbolic of the day that the enemy hoped and planned to destroy you. It's symbolic of the time when the enemy desired to take you, and quite the opposite happened. March 7th could have been the day that you were laid off your job. It could be the day that you received the eviction notice. It could be the day that your spouse or the day that your child died. It could be the day of your breakup or of your divorce. It could be the day of the accident or the day of the troubling diagnosis. It is the day that the enemy just knew that he had you and that you were done, and quite the opposite happened. You didn't die, you didn't lose it, you didn't destroy yourself, you didn't give up on God, you didn't go crazy. You survived that day, you got it past that week, you made it past that month, you survived that year, you survived that period in your life. You've transcended it, you've overcome it, you've come through it, you're getting past it right now. And if this is so, if you don't celebrate any other day, the Lord is saying you need to celebrate on that day. The very day that you came out of the car alive, you need to celebrate. The very day that they handed you the papers, you ought to celebrate. The day that you got the pink slip, you ought to celebrate. The day that he or she walked out on you needs to become a day of celebration. Why? Because God kept you alive to get past that day. The destructive intent of the adversary for your life did not come to pass. The weapon that was formed against you did not prosper. It may have been dark. It may have been hurtful. It may have looked dim. It may have appeared to be dismal. The forecast may have been gloomy and grim, but somehow by the very grace of Almighty God, you were not destroyed. You did not die. You were not so broken that you could not be put back together again. You weren't so far gone that God could not find you, hold you, mend you, heal you, strengthen you, and encourage you. As a matter of fact, I dare say somebody can testify, you've come through it stronger than you were before, wiser than you were before, more prayerful than you were before, more determined than you were before, more grateful than you were before. My God, more willing to give God the praise than you were before. You got a time to remember. The time when God frustrated the plans that the enemy made against you. But there's something else. There's something else for us to remember. And that is, remember God giving you more than you initially asked or thought. God giving you more than you initially asked or thought. Esther's initial request and plan was simply to avert the attack against her people and to destroy those who were against them. Xerxes gave them permission to do so, and so on March 7th, they go out and they kill over 500 people. When Esther returns to Xerxes, who knows what has been done, Xerxes says in verse 12, "But now, what more do you want? It will be granted to you. Tell me, and I will do it." She got what she requested. But when she gets back to the king says, "Now tell me, what more do you want? And I will do it." To which she responds, "Give the Jews permission to do again tomorrow as they have done today, and let the bodies of Haman's 10 sons be impaled on a pole." So the king agreed, and the decree was announced. Let me do again what I just did. Lord have mercy. A time to remember is a time when God gave you more than you initially thought or asked. It is a time when God empowered you to do and then asked you, "Do you need anything else? Can I do anything else for you? What more can be provided? What more can be made available? What more can be added? What more can be offered?" It's the time when God does exceedingly abundantly above all that you've asked or even thought. It's when God surpasses your expectation. It's the time when more came, when better came, when fuller came, when greater came, when further came. It's the time when the how much more of God entered the space of your life. Somebody can testify you weren't looking for it, didn't have it on your mind, may not even have had the faith to even dare approach God about it, but God saw it for you. God wanted it for you. God prepared it for you. God brought you to it. I wonder, am I talking to anybody who can testify about the much more of God? That when people see you, they do not see what you asked for, they see the much more. When people watch you, they do not see what you imagined, they see the much more of God. When people look at you, they do not see what you've accomplished, they see the much more that God had done. I'm talking to somebody who knows that you are so much further than you saw for yourself. You are so much fuller than you imagined for yourself. You have done so much more than you even planned for yourself. And whenever you think about the much more of God, that's a time for you to celebrate and bless the name of the Lord. The times of God frustrating the hopes of the enemy. The times of God giving you more than you initially asked or thought. Those are not the only times to be remembered, but also remember the time when God used the weapons of the enemy against him. Used the weapons of the enemy against the enemy. Verses 24 through 26 read, Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted to crush and destroy them on the date determined by casting lots. The lots were called Purim. But when Esther came before the king, he issued a decree causing Haman's evil plot to backfire, and Haman and his sons were impaled on a sharpened pole. Now, to understand this, we have to understand that Haman, in the midst of his plot, had built gallows upon which he intended for Mordecai to be executed. And God allows Haman to build the gallows. God allows Haman to hatch the plot. God even allows Haman to initiate the plot. And then God uses the very gallows that Haman had built for Mordecai to be executed. God uses those very gallows whereupon Haman and his 10 sons would be executed. For the enemy planned for the destruction of God's people, God used to destroy the enemy. God used the plans of the enemy to fulfill the plans for his people. Now, this may be the one that takes somebody out, because we are called to remember the time when God takes what the enemy meant for our detriment and works it for our good and the enemy's demise. It was Israel remembering God using their seemingly being trapped at the Red Sea, and using the Red Sea that was supposed to be their trap to be the very weapon that destroys Pharaoh and the Egyptian army. It's remembering God using the sword that Goliath was going to use against David, now in David's hands, to cut off Goliath's head. It's Jesus using, it's God using the flames into which the Hebrew boys were thrown, my God, to kill those who threw them into the fire. It's God using the lions whose mouths he shut in the presence of Daniel to devour the very ones that threw Daniel into the lion's den. I'm calling for somebody right now to remember the time when God not only did not allow the weapon formed against you to prosper, but also used that very weapon against your enemy. Remember when God used the lie of your enemy to expose the enemy as a liar. Remember God using the scheme of the enemy to reveal the enemy as a schemer. Remember the time when the very person, my God, the very poison that the enemy was sought to destroy you ended up being the poison that she had to drink. I'm calling on somebody right now to remember God making you the road runner and your hater the coyote, with the trap that was set before you, ensnaring the coyote instead. Remember the anvil that the coyote tried to drop on the road runner, and that very anvil being the one that dropped on the coyote's head. And if that's you, I dare you to give a road runner praise and just start saying beep, beep. I dare you to think about what the enemy thought was going to destroy you, and God made it boomerang and come back on the enemy. I dare you to tweet beep, beep. I dare you to post beep, beep. God used the very thing that the enemy thought was going to take me out to be the thing not only that elevated me, but that exposed the enemy for who he or she really is, and take them out and said, go ahead and post your beep, beep. Go ahead and shout off of your beep, beep. God, you need to remember the time when God uses the very weapon that the enemy sought to destroy you, to destroy the enemy instead. You need to remember the times when God has provided much more than you thought or even asked. You need to remember the very day that the enemy had hoped
to destroy you, and God frustrated the plans of the enemy. But then there's something else. Remember the time when God transformed your sorrow into joy. March 7th was to be a time of immense sorrow and anguish for the Jews. In fact, with the edict that Xerxes made at the suggestion of Haman, March 7th was viewed as a dark and dismal day. Mordecai was despondent and depressed. That's why Esther sent a servant, a messenger, to find out what's going on with Mordecai. Why is he down? Why is he anxious? Why is he despondent? Why is he grieving? It was an anticipated day of destruction and death for God's people. But God worked on their behalf, causing what was expected to be a day of sorrow and turned it into a day of joy. God transformed their time of mourning into a time of joy. You see, friends, we grieve over both the losses that have happened and those that we anticipate happening. Yes, there are times when the anxiety and grief over what we anticipate are removed because God prevents what we anticipated from occurring. There were those who can acknowledge, yes, there were times when what I was anticipating put a dark cloud over my head. It caused me deep worry, constant anxiety. And then by the hand of God, what I was anticipating, God did not allow that to happen. It was removed. God prevented what we were anticipating from occurring. God surprises us with the exact opposite occurring. And in that instance, God transforms what was our mourning in anticipation to our joy in actuality. And as real as those times are, there are those of us who must readily acknowledge that there are times when God turns our sorrow over actual loss. Times when God does not turn it around, when what we were anxiously anticipating does occur, and we grieve and we mourn, and God in time turns our mourning into joy. In either case, whenever God transforms sorrow into joy, we must remember that time. We must celebrate that time. We must share that time. I'm talking to somebody who looks back at the time when God turned your sorrow into gladness. When the weeping that endured for a night was finally met with the joy that comes in the morning. Can you celebrate God keeping you from what you had feared? Can you remember God surprising you with a victory instead of defeat, with healing instead of illness and death? But then there are those of us who did not receive that when what we feared came our way. But we can testify. We can testify that God has not relegated us to a life of misery and mourning. Yes, we've been miserable. Yes, there have been mournful times. Yes, there have been times when there's been no sun up in the sky and it seemed as if all that we had was stormy weather. Yes, there have been times when we didn't want to get out of bed or face the day. But God has brought some joy and gladness. Somebody can testify that God gave you what you needed in the days of weeping to be able to see a day of gladness. God held you in your time of mourning until you got to that time of joy. God dried every tear until you got to a time of laughing and smiling. It may have been a day, it may have been a week, it may have taken a month, or it may have even taken some years, but you can thank God, Lord have mercy, that you can see clearly now that the rain has gone. You can hear clearly now that the noise is gone. And for those of us who are in Christ, Lord have mercy, every Sunday that comes around, I want somebody to hear me. Every Sunday that comes around can be a day of remembering God turning sorrow into gladness and mourning into joy. All that you need to do is look out on a hill called Calvary. Look out on that hill called Calvary, where on a Friday, Lord have mercy, and see the sorrow and the mourning there. See the matchless Lamb of God dying for the sins of the world. See the innocent and holy one of God wrongfully convicted and brutally executed. It was a sad day for Mary, his mother. It was a sad day for the disciples who followed him. That was Friday when they saw him hung high and stretched wide, when it got dark between the 6th and the 9th hour, and when he gave up the ghost. It was like all of their hopes and dreams had died right there on the cross. When they saw the lifeless body of Jesus being taken down from the cross and being put into a grave, and soldiers standing on the outside and a stone covering it so that nobody could go out and nobody could get in. It was a sad time. It was sad on Saturday. It was dark and dismal on Saturday night. But then early Sunday morning, Lord have mercy, early Sunday morning, God raised Jesus from the dead with all power in his hand. And later that day, when he shows up in the upper room where they are hiding out for fear of the Jews, and Jesus comes in and says, "Peace be unto you," shows them his hands and shows them his side. And John, who was an eyewitness, said, "Then were we glad when we saw the Lord." Sunday tells me that there was a time in my sorrow when I will see the Lord and I will be glad. There is a time when I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. There is a time when God will lift the veil and allow me to see clearly, and that time will bring me joy. I'm talking to somebody who can declare, I've had that happen in my own life when I was not expecting the Lord to show up, but then the Lord showed up in the room, showed me who he was, and then gladness came into my heart. My God, my head that was bowed down, but I sang, "You are the lifter of my head. You are the dryer of my tears. You are the renewer of my strength. And yes, you are the giver of my joy." And so I wonder, am I talking to anybody on this Sunday who can say, I'm remembering God turning my sorrow into joy and my mourning into gladness. I'm celebrating seeing the goodness of the Lord. I'm remembering and celebrating God drying my tears and bringing joy in the morning. I am remembering and I'm celebrating God frustrating the expectations of my enemies. I'm remembering and I'm celebrating God allowing the weapon that was formed against me did not prosper, but then God used it to take my enemy. And I'm celebrating and I'm remembering the much more of God. And the more that I remember, the more that I celebrate, the more that I remember, the more that I thank, the more that I remember, the more that I praise, the more that I remember, the more that I glorify God, the more that I remember, the more that I exalt the Lord. As a matter of fact, the more that I remember, I then declare, I will bless the Lord at all times, and his praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul shall make her boast in the Lord. The humble shall hear thereof and be glad. And so here I am. I'm putting the post out. Oh, magnify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together, because I sought the Lord and and he heard me, and he delivered me from all of my fears. What I was anticipating, what I was fretting, what I was worried about, the Lord delivered me from all of my fears. And even when I had to go through, he didn't let me stay in, but he brought me out. And so I'm giving him the glory. I'm giving him the honor. I'm giving him the praise.